Good afternoon, and welcome to today's teach-in on restorative justice in practice and the school to prison pipeline. My name is Aisha Biswas, and I'm a staff member at the Residential College at the University of Michigan. The RC is a four-year liberal arts program and living learning community within U of M. You can learn more about us at the website linked in the chat. Sorry, give me 1 second. We're excited to be able to continue our long-standing tradition of offering teach-ins on important topics, now in a virtual format. Today's webinar is presented in conjunction with an RC summer course titled Restorative Justice, Prison Reform, Abolition, From Theory to Practice. Students in this course, taught by Becca Pickus, who you'll be meeting shortly, complete weekly readings, written assignments, and hear from different presenters every week. Some quick notes before we dive into today's topic. Closed captioning is available and can be turned on or off by clicking the CC button at the bottom of your screen. Please note that all captioning may not be 100% accurate since auto transcription is being used. You will notice that the chat is disabled for participants, but we encourage you to submit questions that you'd like to ask by using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Unfortunately, due to time constraints, we'll not be able to get to everyone's questions. I'm seeing now we have over 100 people in the room. Awesome. Thank you all for joining us. But feel free to use the Q&A button to submit your questions. I'm grateful to have recent RC graduate Erica, who's assisting us today in sorting through your questions. Please be respectful in the questions you submit. And if you would like to report any technical issues, feel free to also use the Q&A function and we'll do our best to assist you. Upon leaving the webinar today, you'll be linked to a brief survey, which we would appreciate if you could fill out. This webinar is also being recorded, and in a few days, you'll be sent a follow-up email with the recording as well as additional resources from our presenters. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Becca Pickus, who is not only today's facilitator, but also a practitioner in the field of restorative justice and will be sharing wisdom of her own. Becca Pickus is a lecturer in the Social Theory and Practice program in the Residential College. She began learning and working in Michigan prisons in 2008, and she currently teaches classes through the Inside Out Prison Exchange program, the Prison Creative Arts Project, and co-facilitates a restorative justice class with and for incarcerated men at Macomb Correctional Facility. Becca is also a clinical social worker with a focus on trauma, grief, and loss, and is passionate about working at the intersections of racial justice, restorative justice, and trauma-responsive practices. So with that, Becca, I'll hand the virtual mic over to you.
Thank you so much, Aisha, for that introduction, and also for all of your invaluable help in setting up this webinar today. So hello, everybody. Welcome. It's such a joy to see, or sort of see, 125 of you is what my participant list says. So that's truly incredible. You know, I think this is a time when a lot of us could use some hope and some inspiration, and being here today with all of you is certainly one of those sources of hope and inspiration for me. So thank you for taking the time and joining us. It is now my pleasure to introduce our two primary speakers today, who are not only incredible and inspiring RJ or restorative justice practitioners and educators, but also my dear friends. So first, Amy Navvab. Amy graduated from the University of Michigan in 2013 with a bachelor's degree in women's studies and psychology and a minor in community action and social change. She also graduated from the University of Michigan School of Social Work in 2014. Upon graduation, she worked in restorative justice for over 5 years in Chicago, Boulder, and Denver, primarily in schools, but also in the criminal justice system. Amy has experience facilitating restorative practices with kindergarten students up to 12th graders, as well as training and supporting adult educators around restorative practices. She recently switched to become a school social worker with the Jefferson County Public Schools in Colorado, and she is still supporting restorative practice in schools as a mental health provider for students. Welcome, Amy. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Becca.
Secondly, we have Daniel Jones. Danny is a mediator, facilitator, speaker, and organizer, and is a project coordinator with the Michigan Collaborative to End Mass Incarceration, or MySemi, which works in collaboration with the Michigan Center for Youth Justice. As a former juvenile lifer, Danny spent his time inside prison doing deep introspective work and mentoring others. In 2012, he worked to develop the Personal Enrichment and Parole Readiness Program, which is now used in several prisons across Michigan. Upon his resentencing and release in March of 2019, Danny worked with the American Friends Service Committee Criminal Justice Program to facilitate a national convening on ending perpetual punishment. And he has recently been contracted to continue this work in Washington, D.C. in an Unlock the Box campaign to end solitary confinement. Welcome, Danny.
Thank you, Becca. Thank you.
Alrighty, so it was great to look through the registration data that all of you submitted and to see that we have such an amazing range of folks here. We have educators in the K-12 system, we have undergraduate and graduate students, we have parents, we have community members, folks who work in the criminal legal system and juvenile justice, and a whole bunch of folks that said they're brand new to these topics, but they're really excited to learn more. So welcome to all of you. And we're going to start off the talk today by thinking about how we would describe our key concepts, which are restorative justice and also the school to prison pipeline. So let's go ahead and start with you, Amy. How would you describe restorative justice?
Yeah, and thank you again, Becca, for having me and putting this together. I'm really excited to be here with all of you. For me, restorative justice is first a mindset, and it's also a community culture of how we are treating one another. And so I like to think of it as first valuing relationships and building community with the people around you, hopefully with a shared set of values, so that when there's harm or when there's conflict, we have processes in place for how we can address the harm. And so in a restorative justice culture, you would have support for people to be accountable for creating harm and being able to take steps to repair that harm with themselves, with the people who are directly impacted, and with the larger community. And also, in addition to repairing, make changes so that harm is less likely to happen again. I also would say that it's important to make sure that in a restorative justice culture, there's support for healing for people who have been harmed and that their needs are centered in the process. And so it's less about a set of practices or a certain program and more about that community culture that you create.
Thank you, Amy. That's such a great start to our discussion today. Danny, what would you like to add to how you describe restorative justice?
First and foremost, definitely like to thank you, Becca, for reaching out and allowing me to be in this space. I'd like to thank U of M for creating this platform and allowing us this opportunity to even have this discussion. Thank you. I totally agree with what Amy just said, and just like to add that in regards to her saying it was a mindset. It's also a lifestyle that embraces community and engages community, and it puts a focus on a collective growth. Amy spoke about there being support for the people that have been harmed, and we also know that people who often cause harm were once upon a time harmed themselves, and they also need support and need to also be made whole again, because we all have gone through experiences that have created trauma in our lives that we either have failed to adequately identify and just find coping mechanisms to help us deal with our pain and our fears and insecurities. But restorative justice would definitely help create those spaces for people to feel safe and comfortable with sharing things that they've gone through, things that they may have on their minds and are dealing with, but oftentimes just don't have the outlet to be able to connect with people, to seek advice, or just to have that that opportunity just to vent and release what it is that they hold on to every day. So it definitely focuses on a collective growth for us all, which also allows us to be able to see ourselves in others, because as we communicate our stories and our pains, we often find similarly situations that we all go through. So that allows us to be able to see ourselves in others, which leads to a mutual respect for one another in our community, despite your skin complexion or your creed or where you come from, your background. We can still have a mutual respect for one another just as human beings. And that also leads to a shared responsibility in our communities. We all are stakeholders. We all have a voice. We all have a story that can be told and shared and can potentially help others get through what it is that they're going through. And again, just to be able to find a way to release that. I'm a firm believer that our pain, we have to be able to give it an expression, whether it be through us talking about it, whether it be through art, or whether it be through writing. That we have to be able to find a way that we can release that and let it go. And hopefully it can be like paying it forward. It can help others get through what it is they're going through. So definitely a collective growth, mutual respect, and a shared responsibility within our communities is, I believe, what restorative justice is.
Thanks so much, Danny. And I'll just share, I agree wholeheartedly with those beautiful descriptions of what restorative justice is. I love thinking about it as a mindset and as a lifestyle. And one of the frameworks that really helped me not only understand what restorative justice is, but really contrast it with what we do in the criminal legal system, which could be described as punitive or retributive justice, is thinking about the questions that we ask when an incident occurs. And so from a restorative justice framework, if an incident occurs, the focus is on harm, which both of you mentioned multiple times. And the question that we ask first is who was harmed? The second question we ask is what are those person's needs? So right away, we're honing in on the person who experienced harm and asking them, what are your needs in this moment as a function of that harm you experienced? The third question is then whose obligations, whose responsibilities is it to attend to that harm? And Daniel, you just really beautifully spoke to the fact that, and Amy mentioned this too, that there are multiple stakeholders from a restorative justice perspective, that we're interested in the needs of the person who was harmed, we're interested in the person who caused harm, but also the larger community, because restorative justice recognizes that relationships and actions and behaviors, they don't happen in a vacuum. They happen within the larger context of community, society, systems, and structures. And then the last question that we'd ask from a restorative justice perspective is, what can be done to make this situation as right as possible? How can repair happen? What does restoration look like? What does reparation look like? And when I started working in restorative justice in the criminal legal system, it was really the incredible men at Macomb who designed the restorative justice class that I have the privilege to co-facilitate. Danny knows all of these guys. And they really showed me the distinction between that framework and exactly what happens in the criminal legal system. And so in the criminal legal system, we ask very different questions. The first question we ask when something occurs is, what law was broken? So we're not interested necessarily in harm. We're interested in a law that was broken or what might be referred to as a crime that was committed. The second question we ask is who did it? And what's really notable here is leapfrogging that question about the person who was harmed and their needs. And the criminal legal system, by and large, does not ask that question and does not create space for the person or the people or the communities that were harmed to say, this is what happened to us, and this is what reparation or restoration or healing would look like. And then the third question that the criminal legal system presents is what punishment does that person deserve? So what law was broken? Who did it? What punishment do they deserve? Really different questions. And as we now transition to thinking about the school to prison pipeline context, this same framework applies in that context as well. We just might substitute the word discipline for justice, because we might be thinking, instead of what crime was committed, quote unquote crime, or what law was broken, we might be asking what rule was broken in the context of a school or a workplace or within a family. And so from the more retributive or punitive framework, we'd maybe ask what rule was broken. And then from the restorative framework, we'd start the same way, which is who is harmed and what do they need. So let's talk more about this school to prison pipeline context and just share some descriptions. So Amy, how would you describe the school to prison pipeline?
Sure, thank you, Becca. First, I would say it's institutionalized oppression. So it happens in formal school policies, but then also informal school practices and culture that result in young people being criminalized in the school system. And so some of the former school policies could be things like a discipline matrix. So X behavior will mean this kind of punishment, and as administration, we have to follow that. It could also be policies that put police in school, or practices that encourage when a student is doing something harmful, they need to be removed. But then it also happens in informal culture and practices within schools. And so that could be, how do families react if a student is in a fight and hurts their kid, and that student does a restorative process instead of a suspension? How do families in the community feel? Do they support that? Are they against it? What kind of conversation are they having with administration that's going to encourage or discourage a restorative practice? It also happens in culture where how do we define respect, and what are the boundaries around how a student is reprimanded if they do something that might feel disrespectful? Will it result in them being able to re-enter the community, or does it create more disconnection and feeling that they don't belong in school classrooms? So I think it happens with both formal and informal school practices.
Thanks, Amy. And Danny, how would you describe the school to prison pipeline?
And so I want to provide like sort of a backdrop to this as well, like almost how the school to prison pipeline started. So in the early 90s, there was a political scientist by the name of, I believe, John DeLoley. He came up with the term super predator in response to like an increase in crime committed by juveniles. And so the media picked that up and ran with it, and in turn came like zero tolerance policies and a heavy reliance on police presence in schools. And I remember when I was 13 years old, I had got caught skipping school, like skipping class. I had got caught in a hall sweep and was placed in handcuffs and taken to the office. My mother was called, and of course I was terrified at what my mother was going to do to me, but her response when she came to the school was, "Could you please take my son out of those handcuffs?" So I'm 13 years old and I'm placed in handcuffs for skipping class. Like, that is the school to prison pipeline. Like that's how that begins to work. And how we know that it's still in place is that every school that I have gone to, from kindergarten to high school, is now closed in the city of Detroit. But there are more prisons in place than when I first went in 1996, which is the same year that there were over 100 juveniles sentenced to life without the possibility of parole across the country. So here it is, we have this rhetoric which has clearly proven to be incorrect, because I was one of those juveniles who was labeled a super predator. I was told that no programming would work for me in a juvenile or an adult correctional facility, and that a life without the possibility of parole sentence was the only sentence that was going to cure anything, bring justice. But of course, later, science proved that as a juvenile, it's hard to say that you have a concrete personality, like this is who you are. Science has shown that people gradually age out of crime, and that rhetoric has tend to cease, but yet the results of that rhetoric are still in place, with overpopulated prisons and more schools being closed down. So that, in essence, along with what Amy definitely described, those zero tolerance practices and the over-reliance on policing, that is ultimately the school to prison pipeline.
Thank you, Danny. And thank you for sharing a bit about your own experience. And we'll hear a lot more about that in a little bit. So let's transition now to talking about what RJ looks like in practice and how RJ can be used as a response to the school to prison pipeline. And so Amy, why don't we start, if you could talk to us a bit about what your work with RJ in schools looks like.
Yeah, thanks, Becca. So I'm hoping to tell just a few stories. I've worked in Chicago at a nonprofit called Emoja, and we were a nonprofit that would partner with schools to implement restorative practices. And then in Denver, I worked directly for schools in a K-8 school. So like we talked about in the beginning of this, I've worked with kindergartners up to 12th graders doing restorative practices. And so let me just share a few stories about what it can look like. So one of my favorite students, we'll call him Ben. He was a second grader when I worked in the school in Denver. And Ben came to us from a different school. His family felt like the other school wasn't meeting his needs. They pull him out, put him in our school in the middle of October. And he was having a really hard time adjusting. If a student looked at him the wrong way, he often would have an outburst. If the teacher didn't pick him to be a leader, like I need someone to pass out papers, he didn't get picked, he might get really upset. And when he got really upset, it was really harmful to the class community. So he would be throwing pencils, and he was pretty strong. He could pick up a chair and throw it. And he was trying to communicate like something's not right. So as a school, we developed a process. How do we respond if a student is doing something harmful? And so what we would do when that would happen with Ben is, first, the teacher would try to de-escalate. And so we made sure that teachers had some restorative training on how to do a conversation. And so sometimes that conversation would work and Ben could calm down and express what he needed, and they could figure it out within the classroom context. But sometimes it wouldn't work, and he would get more and more upset. And so the teacher then would have a plan that she would leave with the class, and another support person would come in and be with Ben. And so that would be me. My role was a restorative justice counselor. So I would be called on a walkie-talkie, come in the room, be with Ben while the class left. And we weren't removing Ben because he was so escalated that he probably wouldn't listen if we were like, come on, let's go. And at that point, the class needed to get out of the room so that they weren't having a chair thrown at them. And so the teacher then has a safe place to go with the class to debrief what was going on. And they're second graders. Many of them are scared or confused. It was supposed to be a reading lesson, and now they're out of the room. We're not going to pretend like that didn't just happen and keep going with the lesson. We're going to talk about what's going on. And so with the class, they would do a circle, and often we would have the class write a letter to Ben. So it would be like, "Dear Ben, I feel scared when you're throwing pencils. I need you to ask for a break next time instead of throwing things in our classroom." So each student would write Ben a letter while I was working with Ben to de-escalate him. And I think an important part in RJ work in schools is we need to separate de-escalation from RJ. Becca gave a few very important questions that we use in restorative practices, but it doesn't work if Ben is really heightened emotionally to just start asking those questions and doing a restorative conversation. So it takes a lot of time. We de-escalate completely, and once he's ready, often we would have that stack of letters. We'd get to hear from Ben what were you feeling? What do you need? How do you think other people are feeling? What can we do to make it right? And we would read the letters. And so he would understand how other students felt when he behaved that way and what they need. And often it would result in Ben writing a letter back to the class saying, here's what I heard from you all, here's what I can commit to doing. And as a school, that could be the restorative process, but we also would need to follow up with additional interventions. And so we need to support Ben in learning social emotional skills so that when he's starting to feel upset, he can be aware of it and make a different choice next time. And so with that wraparound support, it wasn't one time and Ben stopped throwing chairs, but over time, he was able to use different skills. And also the way that we responded when he was harmful helped Ben feel like, okay, if I make a mistake, it's a learning opportunity and I can still maintain relationships. So I'm not going to feel separated or ashamed. I'm going to be able to feel confident in my ability to, even if I do something wrong, make it better. And that helped the class community in general feel connected and supported when something went wrong. They didn't feel shamed when that would happen. So that's one example from second grade. I don't know if Becca or Danny, you want to jump in at all, but it would look similar at a high school level, but also the process might be a little different. So when I worked in a high school, I was partnered with the school. So I was coming in not as a school staff member, but as a partner. And my role was to create a restorative space in the school called a peace room. And that was a space where students or staff could request a restorative practice. And there was me, an adult who was trained in this type of work, to lead them through these practices. I also was tasked with helping just create a more restorative school culture. So that would get more at how do we help adults with their RJ mindset, and how do we make it so that we're prioritizing a strong community culture. So helping teachers feel like, even if I'm a math teacher, how do I build strong community, and doing the time for community building circles or getting to know students and having that strong base was a lot of my work too. But when there was conflict, we would have the space in the peace room to be able to do a peace circle. And similar to what it was like with Ben, it would be hearing that a student was upset. Maybe they felt like they wanted to have a fight with somebody because of something that went wrong, listening to what they needed, and then doing a separate conference with the other student to see what they thought happened, what they needed, and if they were open to coming together to do a process to talk about what happened and figure out where do we go from here. And so in that year, I did probably 500 peace circles. And so we would have almost an open door policy that if a student felt like they needed to talk it out with somebody, as a staff, we made time and we would say, okay, you can have a pass to go to the peace room and work through this. And so after doing that, the culture started to shift that we can address things in our community by using these tools. And so at the beginning of the year, there was a lot of fights, and there was a police officer who worked the front desk who often would be called to go upstairs. And when he's called to go upstairs, his option is to either maybe de-escalate the kid or arrest them for engaging in a physical fight. But when I would be called in, we would have a different toolbox to use. And so I remember talking to him at the end of one of my years, and he was saying, you know what, I haven't been upstairs as much. Like, I think that's because these kids are good. We got good kids now. And I remember thinking, I don't think the kids are different, but I think the tools and culture we created is different. And that was because of RJ. So those are two stories. I'm looking at time. Becca, I might flip it back to you. And then if we have more time, I have other stories I could share.
That sounds great, Amy. Thank you so much for sharing those stories. I know in the questions we received, a lot of people started their questions by saying, I'm a kindergarten teacher, or my dream is to be a second grade teacher. What would it look like to use RJ, especially with younger kids in elementary schools? And so your description of your process with Ben, I think, is so illustrative. And then, of course, thinking about how to use that with older kids in school contexts as well. So let's go to Danny now. And Danny, I'm curious, can you tell us a little bit about when were you introduced to RJ? How did the framework of RJ kind of change your perspective? And how does that inform the work that you've been doing for years, both when you were inside and now that you're home?
Let's see, I was introduced to restorative justice while incarcerated. You know, I had reached a point where it was like, how did I get here? And I wanted something different for myself. And I was introduced by a friend to, you know, the law library. So I started to go to the law library and, you know, in hopes of just trying to, you know, like research my case, find a way out. And in doing so, I was able to like come across law reviews that were written by professors or college students in a way that they perceive the current criminal punishment system in hopes of, you know, finding alternatives. And restorative justice was something that came up as an alternative to the current system. So I began to read it and you know, research it, and it spoke to me, like, because it spoke to that humanity and community of just people seeking to help one another and create safe spaces for people to, again, be able to just, you know, address their pains and confront the issues that weigh on them. And, you know, the more I began to study it, the more I began to see, like, this is, you know, again, it's a mindset. It's a change in the way that I think. It's a change in the way that I interact with other people. And I wish I went to the school that Amy spoke about, because that's definitely what I needed as a youth. I needed somebody to communicate to me. I often felt alone and confused and scared, but I never really knew how to articulate those emotions. And so through, you know, during my incarceration, through the development of the personal enrichment and parole readiness program, it helped put me in a space where I knew that I had to be able to connect with people and engage them on a level that would allow them to feel comfortable and willing to share, you know, their pain and their trauma. And it took years for me to develop that voice, because for years I didn't have it. I didn't know how to articulate my thoughts and, you know, express my emotions and just really address the fears and concerns and insecurities that I had within myself. And so through that, it helped me connect a lot of dots in my life and just do that introspection where I was asking myself, how did I get here? I was able to trace back the steps that I had made in order to get to where I was at. And I had a lot of trauma with, you know, my parents, you know, their separation was a turning point in my life. Then my stepfather coming in, and he was abusing drugs. Him and my mother would fight a lot. So like the crime and the violence and the drugs that were once outside of my household has now come inside of it. And yet and still there, I still don't have the ability to really talk about what's going on with me, like where my confusion is coming from, where my anger is coming from. I didn't have those outlets. And so with, you know, with restorative justice, again, it provides those spaces. It creates those spaces for people to be able to step into and engage the community and share with, you know, share with everyone what's going on with them, just in hopes of finding some sort of guidance, some counseling, and in hopes of just, you know, healing from the harm that has been caused. And just my journey with restorative justice is still ongoing. I still find ways to you know, tear down barriers between me and other people, find ways to acknowledge the prejudices that I have in my own mind and say, you know, well, let me rethink this. Like, this is based on just what I've heard. Like, I have no real knowledge of this person as an individual. So it definitely allows us to just engage one another. And as Amy spoke to, just as a teacher to a student, or as a parent to a child, as a peer to a peer, just being able to understand what a person has been through, their experiences, it gives you so much more to that person than just an isolated incident, or them throwing a desk, or them getting caught skipping class. It just gives you much more content to that person, and a means to be able to connect with them and help them navigate through that trauma that either distorts our thinking or just causes us to go into a shell and lash out as soon as something rubs us the wrong way. So again, like restorative justice, I have found definitely when put into actual practice, it provides a safe space for healthy communication and dialogue for people to learn more about one another, and again, ultimately to be able to just identify with the human aspects of a person and to be able to engage them on that level as human beings first and foremost before anything else.
Thanks, Danny. So we just have about 10 minutes left before we'll transition to the Q&A portion. I see a bunch of questions coming in, so please keep sharing those. We look forward to answering them. But before we do that, I actually want to pose one more question, which was the most common question posed by folks in their registration information, which was folks really wanted to know from their own positionality how they could get involved with this work, how they could support this work. And so people identified in many different ways. We had folks saying, you know, as an undergraduate student, how can I get involved with this work? As a teacher, how can I get involved with this work? As a parent, as a community member. So I'm wondering if we can speak to specific ways to get involved and contribute to RJ and to interrupting the school to prison pipeline. So Amy, I'm wondering if maybe you can start and specifically give us some information about how maybe teachers and parents and folks in that community of public schools and K-12 education can contribute.
Absolutely. First, I would say if you are part of a school community, I would ask to review the school discipline matrix and ask questions, maybe create even within your own school an event where you ask the principal or decision makers, how do you respond when there is crisis and how do you discipline children at this school? And from there, start conversations on what is needed to shift that. So many times I think in a school, no one is asking about that, and so there aren't changes made. I know most restorative justice work in schools came from organizing, so communities and young people organizing and demanding that they have funding for restorative justice practitioners to be in the school. I think also if you're a teacher, I would ask about what is the social emotional learning curriculum, because a lot of restorative justice work can be done with classroom teachers, even in high school. So thinking about what is the curriculum that might be used, and maybe it's in a homeroom or an advisory class. I would also think about how does your administrator feel about you taking time to do restorative practices in your classroom. So I think part of the informal culture that can drive the school to prison pipeline is just an intense focus on testing and an intense focus on we need to be following this academic curriculum and pressure to bring results. And so teachers are afraid, like if I walk in and my administrator walks in and sees me doing a circle or taking time to do icebreakers or things that help build community in my classroom, are they going to think that I am doing the best work, or are they going to kind of reprimand me? And so how as teachers can you advocate for time and space to have social emotional learning in classrooms? I would also say whenever there's restorative justice work, there's a need for mental health work. And so how are schools receiving enough funding to have enough counselors and social workers so that when students like Ben might be experiencing trauma, like how do we help provide that mental health and one-on-one support? Because as an RJ practitioner, I was in a place where I was kind of on the fence of doing some of that mental health work. I think there's a big overlap, but really we need more funding for people who have that training to be doing that work too. So how do we fund mental health work in schools?
Thanks, Amy. And Danny, how can maybe especially community members, maybe undergraduate students, really everyone get involved in, and maybe if you could specifically talk a bit about the work you're doing with AFSC, the American Friends Service Committee, and also with myumi and the Michigan Council for Youth Justice.
Absolutely. I think that the biggest way that anybody can get involved with restorative justice and restorative justice practices is to do a self-check. We have to be mindful in every moment of how we engage people and how we choose to interact with one another. We definitely need to move away from the punishment first theory or practice, that when somebody does harm or does something wrong, that the appropriate response to that is to punish them in order for them to have a better understanding of what not to do. That's not always the case. I remember the very first time I was arrested, I was 10 years old. A couple of friends and I, we were stealing out of the corner store, and the people knew we were stealing, and as we exited, they had the double doors. So they locked them as we went out, and we were trapped. They called the police. We were taken to a precinct. We were fingerprinted, and our parents were called. And in my mind, I was more afraid of what my mother was going to do to me than actually sitting in a holding cell. And when my mother showed up, she asked me, like, okay, did you learn your lesson? And I was like, yeah. And that was that. Like, so I guess, you know, she thought that me doing a few hours in a holding cell would allow me to have that moment of deterrence. It was like, oh, let me change my ways. But that didn't help. That form of punishment did not help me better understand that what I was doing was ultimately going to lead me down a path that I really didn't want to go down. And so like that, you know, my past experiences, my stay in prison, like all of that, I was able to identify within me, like what I was doing wrong, and you know how my life had taken a turn for the worse, and that definitely like fuels my work now. Like me being the project coordinator for myumi. myumi was an organization that I was introduced to while in prison, while I was part of an organization called the National Lifers of America Incorporated, which also sought to like just end mass incarceration, try to help people put themselves in better positions, think more of themselves, and just make better choices for themselves. That still carries on into the work that I do now with, you know, as a consultant for American Friends Service Committee. I still help people serving life and long indeterminate sentences like navigate their way through the parole process, the commutation process, and public hearings. Just trying to give insight and feedback on how they, one, take responsibility and be held accountable for the harm that they caused, their willingness to show empathy and be remorseful for their acts. So it's like me studying restorative justice. These are concepts and principles deeply ingrained within restorative justice theories and practices that a lot of people, especially people in prison, may have heard of the terms, but never really had the opportunities to engage in conversations about it and be able to internalize it and make it their own. So again, with the personal enrichment and parole readiness program, those were key concepts that we chimed in on and just created a space for people to have dialogue. And again, just be able to internalize the concepts and be able to speak to it from their own point of view using their own words. And that's exactly how undergraduate students, teachers, anybody, church members, community members, we have to be able to address and look at the way that we view how we interact with one another. Punishment is not the answer. And I believe we spoke in another conversation about this, Becca, like borrowing from, I forget exactly how we put it, but borrowing from punishment, not to use punishment per se, but to be able to allow people space away from the situation, not to remove them and send them to prison, but I believe, Amy, you spoke to this, like maybe sometimes you just need to pull a person out of the classroom and talk to them in the hallway.
Mhm.
Sometimes people need to be removed from the situation because if too much can just cause it to be more volatile. So sometimes separation is needed in order for people to really understand the gravity of what just happened, and to be able to be held accountable and say, I acknowledge what I did was wrong, and be able to offer up that explanation and that reason as to why I did what I did, and to offer that apology. So
I think
again,
we had
like,
talked about, Danny, how sometimes people do need to step away, but if there's a path for them to return, then it can still be
absolutely,
restorative. I know when I started
absolutely,
in the high school, I was like, a kid can never be removed from class, which was this like purity politic that wasn't realistic because kids needed to step out of the classroom and they couldn't necessarily calm down always in that moment or do that restorative response immediately. So how do we have pathways for people to come back when they're ready?
absolutely, and that's what restorative justice provides. It allows us to think creatively as to how we can engage this person and reach them on their level. And so, yes, I definitely encourage undergrad students, law students, clergy people, everybody, community members to read up on restorative justice and get your own interpretation and understanding of what restorative justice is, its practices, its principles, and just look for the ways that you can apply them in your everyday interactions with your children, with your loved ones, with your family, your friends, with authority, especially with authority. People who it may be a supervisor, it may be police officers, but we have to be creative in the way that we interact with one another, so that we don't escalate situations. We try to de-escalate and keep calm, ensure that we're here just to help bring healing, restore people, make them whole again. And so I definitely encourage everyone to first and foremost and assess and analyze the way that we view crime and punishment and harm and healing, and be able to make the distinction between the two mindsets, those two frameworks, and be able to find ourselves in restorative justice and how we utilize it and practice it in our everyday lives.
Thanks so much, Danny. So I'm going to add just two other kind of quick logistical ways, that I really encourage folks to get involved. And one of them, specifically for undergraduates, if you do go to the University of Michigan, you have a really unique opportunity to participate in a lot of programs in which you get to learn in prisons and in collaboration and in dialogue with incarcerated students and incarcerated artists. And one of the things that is so important is to find ways to center the voices of those most deeply impacted by systems of oppression and by injustices, center those voices in imagining the solutions and the creative alternative ways that we can cultivate communities and systems of justice and healing and restoration that don't prioritize punishment for punishment's sake. And so society is organized in ways to separate us when it comes to the criminal legal system. That is one of the purposes. Amy's talked about it, Danny's talked about it, this idea that if someone causes harm or someone breaks a rule or breaks a law, that the response is that they have to be removed from community, that they have to be isolated away from their community. And the focus is not on what Amy and Danny talked about, on providing resources, maybe mental health support, de-escalation services, treatment, skill building. In our criminal legal system, the focus in that removal is punishment for punishment's sake. And just like Amy and Danny said, the removal isn't the problem. Restorative justice isn't the set of practices, it's the framework that guides them. And sometimes it's very necessary to temporarily remove somebody from a situation, particularly if being in that situation is combined with a threat of harm or a threat of violence to themselves or to those around them. And so a temporary removal can be life-saving, can be profoundly useful, but the removal within a restorative framework would be for the purposes of restoring and returning and reintegrating that person as a fully participating member of that community. It's so important that as we think about what these communities look like, that the voices of the folks who live in our prisons right now, who in the words of abolitionist thinkers, Angela Davis and Ruth Wilson Gilmore and Miriam Kava talk about folks that we've locked in cages, that those are the people in so many ways whose voices need to be centered in our conversations for how we can do this differently. And then also centering the voices of folks who have been victims and survivors of crime and of violence and of harm, which, as Danny said, those are so often the same people. So for students who have an opportunity to learn with and from incarcerated artists and students, and for community members and I really encourage you to take advantage of those opportunities and to do that with folks returning to our communities as well. The second recommendation I have is for those who are able to vote. And specifically, I want to highlight the importance of the role of prosecutor. And for those of you who are in Michigan, we have an election coming up in less than a week on August 4th, and we will be voting for prosecutorial candidates in our counties. And so just really briefly, Danny talked about how in the 90s, we saw this burgeoning of punitive punishment, the criminalization of youth, and sort of the school to prison pipeline and all of its manifestations. And during that same era, we saw the passing of a lot of sentencing policies, mandatory minimums, truth in sentencing laws, 3 strikes laws, and all of these policies within the criminal legal system removed discretion from judges that they used to have in sentencing people. And that power now actually lies in the hands of prosecutors. Prosecutors determine what to charge somebody with in the criminal legal system. And so they have tremendous power, and they can decide, for example, whether to charge a juvenile or as an adult. They can decide whether to levy a charge that comes with a mandatory minimum of 25 to life or to charge something different. They can decide whether to charge somebody with something that threatens their immigration status or to choose something that doesn't threaten their immigration status. And these are just a couple examples. And so it's a very timely moment to check out who's running for prosecutor in these local races. And if anyone wants more insight from an organization that's deeply committed to decarceration and restorative justice and abolition and community responses to healing, I really encourage you to check out Michigan Liberation, which is a local organization here in Southeast Michigan. They have really thorough information about the upcoming prosecutor races. So check those out. And if you're able, I encourage you to vote and to talk with others. Not everyone has the prosecutor race on the top of their mind when they think about voting, and it's in no way the only important race happening. Please look at who's running for judge. Please, of course, presidential candidates, they all matter, but prosecutors are really important in the criminal legal system. And then from a local perspective, who's on your school board? Because those folks are making really important decisions around disciplinary policies in schools. All righty, so those are my quick recommendations. Amy, Danny, do either of you want to add anything at this moment? And then I'm going to turn and look at some of these great questions that are coming in.
No, I'm ready for your question.
Okay.
I don't know, Danny, do you have anything?
All right, sorry, there are so many good ones and I'm just peeking through this list. Well, one question that came in that I thought was really interesting, and it was, I think, primarily for Amy, but of course anyone can respond, is in what ways do you think restorative justice in school intersects with mass incarceration? And do you think restorative justice practices in schools are a particularly effective way of interrupting the school to prison pipeline?
Could you say the first part of the question, Becca? I want to make sure I answer it.
Yeah, so the literal wording of this question, let me find it, was, it says, "Hi, Amy. It sounds like you are doing all of the work I hope to someday do myself." And with that, I would like to ask you about the intersection between working with youth in terms of restorative justice practices and the fight against mass incarceration within the criminal legal system. And do you find that practicing RJ with youth is an effective way to combat the larger system of mass incarceration, and also one of the best ways to combat that system long term?
Awesome. Thank you for whoever asked that question. I can start, Danny, and I think you would have ways to add in too. I do feel like having supportive schools is a really important piece in addressing mass incarceration. And so when we have schools where children feel like they belong, when they feel like they have motivation to learn and grow and connect with other people, I think that is an intervention that can help prevent mass incarceration. Hand in hand with, we need to have schools that aren't actively criminalizing our young people. And so if we have, I believe that young people should have access to mental health within our school system, knowing that we live in a world with so much trauma and oppression that should be baseline accessible in our school system. And so if we can have schools an intervention for a lot of the harm done to communities, that can be a key part of preventing the school to prison pipeline. However, I do think that schools are often the dumping ground to solve all problems in our society and are not given enough resources or support to really be creative. And so even working in RJ, I think I often felt like there wasn't enough of me to be able to do all the work that was needed. Teachers are often overworked and expected to do way more than they're capable of doing in a 40-hour work week. And I think it's laughable that people would think teachers could have a 40-hour work week, but they also should have boundaries on what is work and what is their life. And so, yes, it's effective, but it also is not a magic solution to it all because there's so many intersecting problems.
And definitely, I agree with that 100%. I knew that I needed someone to connect with me, like somebody to engage me and sit me down, and someone who knew like where I was coming from, what I was going through, and could relate to me. I didn't have that going to school. It's like the focus was on the schoolwork. Like I needed to get the schoolwork done, and it was never hard for me to comprehend schoolwork. Like schoolwork was easy for me, but it never really challenged me. It never really held my interest. So that's why like I love going to school, but for all the wrong reasons. I like to go to school because that's where all my friends were. You know, a lot of girls was there, and it was a fashion show. So it's like I didn't go to school to do the work, but I needed help with work, like internal work. I needed somebody to help me get through what I was going through and give me some skill sets, like some coping strategies. So of course, if there were more social workers, you know, present in school than police, like I definitely feel like there would be, you know, a lot less animosity between students, and a lot less tension in schools or in people. It would be a lot less tension that people carried around if they were able to just connect with people and have somebody like mentor them or help them get through. I remember one time I had received a report card and it was all F's, and it was a teacher who was giving it to me, like passing out the report card, and the teacher was like, "I think you might need to go see the guidance counselor." And I'm in high school. Probably like in the 10th grade at the time. And this is my first time ever hearing of a guidance counselor. I was like, there's guidance counselors here? Like, who is that? She pointed me in the direction of somebody, you know, who was the guidance counselor. I went and I talked with her, and she gave me a job in the library. Now, that was something totally different than, you know, me sitting in the classroom and trying to read American history or political science or algebra. Like, it gave me a different experience in school that was helping me learn how to interact with people, how to communicate better with people, because now I had people who would just ask me how my day was and, you know, what's going on with me, instead of, do you have your homework? Are you ready for today's assignment? It wasn't just about the schoolwork, but at the same time, like, me getting with that guidance counselor, it was like, it was a little too late for me at that time. I was already heavily involved with drugs and crime and the street life. So, but I see that early on, if students and children have that example of somebody who's willing to open up to them, talk to them about, you know, things that they're going through, and then ask them like, what's going on with you? I think that definitely de-escalate a lot of the tension that we carry, and definitely deter a person from making a horrible mistake that could cost them their lives, ultimately.
Thank you, Danny. I just want to acknowledge that a lot of the questions coming in are asking about sharing this webinar as a resource in your communities or with students or with teachers, and also asking about, could you, for example, a student asked, could we share some of the specific opportunities for U of M students to get involved, or could we share some resources for teachers? And so the blanket answer to all of those questions is yes. We will send a follow-up email. You are more than welcome to share this webinar. You will get a link, and Amy, Danny, and I are more than happy to share both our contact information in that follow-up email and specific resources that could be useful for you. So for all of those questions, yes. So the next question that I want to ask, we have a question that is asking how we understand RJ in relationship to police and prison abolition. And I think this is a really interesting and important question. And I think it's deeply related to some of the questions I also see coming in around funding. And Amy so importantly mentioned that we do not have nearly enough funding currently allocated to teachers, to mental health professionals, to social workers, to counselors. All of these folks are grossly underpaid and grossly overworked. And so where does this funding come from? And I guess maybe I'll jump in with an idea and then pass it off to both of you, that the key is reallocation of funding. It's a divest invest model. So often in communities and in the country in some ways, our largest budget goes to military, goes to policing. In states, it goes to prisons. There is a lot of money that is theoretically invested in what might be referred to as maintaining public safety, or preventing violence. And I use quotation marks because we have so many decades of evidence at this point clearly demonstrating that our hyper-investment in incarceration, our unique, our investment in policing and incarceration that is unlike pretty much any other country in the entire world, it has by no means made us safer. It has not reduced violence. It has not reduced crime in measurable or consistent ways. And it has certainly not made our communities healthier or safer places for lots of people. And in many ways, these systems have actually generated profound harm and profound violence disproportionately against communities of color and low-income communities. And so when we talk about where does the money come from, I read in one of these recent articles, folks were saying budgets are moral documents, that there are millions, there are billions of dollars being put into policing. That's where the money comes from. And so that's an abolitionist call. That's a defund call. And we're seeing it. This is an incredible moment to be interested and passionate about these topics. I was just reading, I'm originally from Oakland, California. And so the Oakland Unified School District was my first school district. And I was reading just a couple weeks ago that that school district is one of the school districts in the country that has its own, or had its own, police force. So this is not the police force for the city of Oakland. This is the police force for the Oakland Unified School District. So it had a police sheriff and officers whose only job was to be in the schools. And with resounding support from the police sheriff, they defunded. The sheriff of that police force said, this is not how we should be spending and allocating our money. And I vote to defund my own job and to reallocate this money in ways that would better support our students and our community. I think just in the last few days, Ypsilanti Public Schools, for those of you here in Southeast Michigan, they just cut ties with their officers that they had in their schools. So this is happening, these conversations about defunding. But I want to say one other thing that I've been thinking a lot about. And I think the idea of abolition has a little bit of a PR challenge because abolition talks about removing something. It talks about abolishing something. And people are often left then with this question, so we just get rid of it? What do we do then? But when we actually read and listen to these profound abolitionist thinkers, again, I'll list them, Angela Davis and Ruth Wilson Gilmore and Mariame Kaba, please go read them, please fund their work, please cite them. As we look at these folks who've been doing this incredible work genuinely for decades, what all of them are saying is that abolition is about obsolescence. So Angela Davis has the famous book, Are Prisons Obsolete? It's not just about removing something. It's about rendering that institution obsolete because of the profound investment in meeting all of the needs that lead to people to later end up, for example, in the prison system. So what we're talking about when we talk about abolition is we're talking about investment in mental health services, in economic opportunities, in other access to healthcare treatment, in safe and heavily resourced public schools. We're thinking about investment and a reallocation. So that's one of my ideas, and I'll pass it off to Amy and Danny. So anything you want to share about the relationship between RJ and abolition?
Danny, do you want to start? You can go.
Yeah, definitely. So in the state of Texas, they codified into law victim offender mediations. And victim offender mediation is it's a space where a person who was harmed can confront the person who caused the harm, and the person who caused the harm can take accountability for the harm that they caused, and in hopes of, just, again, like finding closure, healing from, the harm that was caused, and just moving forward from that. And so they codified that into law as an option for victims to be able to utilize. The same could be done in the state of Michigan through the William Van Rigamorta Crime Victims' Right Act. We could codify into law victim offender mediations or any other sort of restorative justice practice that we would wish to put in place and we could train people to be mediators. We could train people in restorative justice practices. We can have centers that solely focus on these practices and can provide these opportunities and resources to people who are willing to engage in these restorative justice practices. I'm a firm believer that one way to abolish the prison industrial complex is to get into it and work our way from the inside out. That's one way that we can get into the current criminal punishment system and begin to change it and create something different that will make courts and the current practices obsolete to the new alternative, which would be, of course, restorative justice. And like you were just speaking to, Becca, of course it takes funding, but if we divest and invest into these centers, these training centers, for training to be mediators and counselors and restorative justice practitioners, that's absolutely how we abolish prisons and move away from crime and punishment and move towards harms and healing. Definitely can do that.
Yeah.
And
I would just like to add that I think working in RJ has often felt like I'm reducing harm of being a part of systems that are harmful. And so the school system inherently is set up to harm young people in certain ways. And so we're trying to change it from within. When I worked in a nonprofit, like we were working within the nonprofit industrial complex. So we were working to get funding and advertise our stories so that people would invest in our work, which then can shift what our focus is. And so we're always working within systems that are inherently complicated. But I think within schools, you can think of what are the small choices I'm making to make police irrelevant. And so what am I doing to build a relationship with the student so that they can trust me and come to me when they need to de-escalate or talk to somebody? What am I doing to say, I will be the person to sit here with you while you calm down, instead of picking up the phone and saying, we need an officer to come? What are we doing so that we keep it in-house to protect our young people instead of relying on police? And so making small choices, knowing that there are times when I'm a social worker, so I'm a mandated reporter, and all adults in schools are mandated reporters. So there are times when if a student discloses child abuse, we are calling the police, knowing that that system can be more harmful than helpful, because we live in a school system that says we are trusting you as adults to always use this option to address harm, even if you disagree with it. Our risk, some social workers might say, I will risk my job and not mandate report. So I think we have to make these choices day by day of how are we investing in our community and the relationships instead of relying on punitive measures or policing.
So we have a question, and I think well, I don't know, I was gonna say maybe it pertains more to thinking about the criminal legal system, but I actually want to retract that notion. So we have a question about sort of the rights and needs of the victims or the survivors of harm. And especially with the public narratives that we so often hear that crime and punishment is done in the name of and for the purposes of supporting victims and survivors of harm. And I think it's so important that that question was raised, because in so many ways we have actually failed to ask victims and survivors of harm and of crime what in fact does support their healing. And I'm just thinking right now to a resentencing hearing that I attended a couple weeks ago over Zoom for one of the men who's been one of my most profound teachers. And he's a juvenile lifer, and he just got resentenced, and he will be coming home soon. But in this resentencing hearing, I was so struck. Yeah, it's Jamal, Danny. So in this resentencing hearing, I was just so struck because they had reached out, of course, to the adult children of the victim in this case. So this was another case where a young man, you know, a juvenile, had been involved in a situation and it was complex and there was profound trauma and coercion and a lack of ability to meet one's basic needs. And it was a drug-related robbery. It went wrong and someone was killed. And this man has now served 34 years since a juvenile in prison for the murder charge. And at his resentencing hearing, when they reached out to the adult children of his victim, they wrote in and they said, we want this man to go home. That in every way, he has spent 34 years of his life atoning for, he has very much paid his debt. And beyond that, this is one of the men that I work closely with who has actually designed a full 14-week restorative justice class that he has now co-facilitated 20 times over the last 5 years for incarcerated men at Macomb. He is one of the men who has taught me more about restorative justice, not just in theory, but primarily in practice than anyone in the world. And I can't wait for him to come home so that people on the outside can learn with and from him. But what really struck me in this resentencing hearing is that the person representing the state kept saying over and over again, we cannot forget the victim. We cannot forget the man who was killed, despite the fact that his adult children had actually spoken. And they said, what we see as healing, what we see as the correct response is to let this man go home and continue his restorative justice work. So I think that I just want to really encourage people. There's some groups doing amazing research with victims and survivors of crime and violence. And I will share those resources out with the follow-up email, but to really make sure, just as we need to talk with the individuals who have both been most directly impacted by the prison system as we imagine a new system, we need to talk to the actual people who've experienced harm to hear what they want and need. And there's this quote that I love that Danielle Sered writes in her book, Until We Reckon, which I recommend to everybody. And she said, the choice people make when given a single option is not indicative of the choice they will make when given multiple options. And for so many people who have been harmed, so many victims and survivors of violence and of crime, the only option they have been offered for so long is locking the person up. And that when given other options, they so regularly choose for that person to be healed in ways to make sure that they don't commit harm again. So that's just a point I wanted to share about thinking about the perspective of the victims and the survivors of harm. And I just want to now pass it off and see if Amy and Danny want to add anything.
Yeah, just to chime in on that, I'm also a firm believer that like one of the worst things that we can do as people is become that which we fight against or despise. So again, this goes back to that self-check. Like if what we're trying to move away from is punishment for a wrongdoing, then we have to be mindful of how we engage people that have wronged us. If we have a unwillingness to forgive, unwillingness to give a second chance at some, if we are quick to judge and belittle or minimize a person for something that they've done, right, we have to check that. We have to really look at that and understand within ourselves, why do I think like this? Where is this coming from? What is this connected to? And we have to uproot that thinking from our own psyches in order to allow an alternative to that to come in and take root, and for us to nurture it as individuals, as a collective whole. We definitely have to look within ourselves before we recreate the same system that we're seeking to abolish. Yeah.
Thank you, Danny. the only thing that is on my mind to add is who are the victims of crime and violence, who is safe to come forward, because in many communities of color and in many LGBTQ communities, which overlap, there's not trust to come forward, and there isn't a real option to call the police. And so some of those communities have actually been doing restorative practices because they knew that the option to go to the police wasn't there. And so there's lots of great examples of those communities figuring out how do we do this work without policing, because being a victim within the criminal justice system is not indicative of everyone who's been harmed by crime.
Awesome, thank you. So I'm noticing we just have 5 minutes left. And I'm wondering if maybe there's one question which maybe we could address quickly. I know, Amy, you've spoken to this really eloquently. If you could just identify for folks the difference between restorative justice and transformative justice, because I know a lot of folks who are studying or learning about these philosophies, and Danny, please jump into that. Sometimes there can be some confusion or some questions about these two philosophies.
Yeah, so I think for me, a difference is the end goal. So transformative justice may argue that we don't want to restore it back to the conditions that were in place when the harm was caused. We need to move past those conditions, that relationship, whatever was present, into creating a more equitable or just culture or society. And so it's really pushing us that if there's a conflict between two people, it's not just that they go back to what it was before, but that it's evolving and changing. But it's deeper than that. I think people who do transformative justice work are often critical that that can't exist within the current criminal justice system, or it can't exist within even the current school system, because there's so many layers of oppressive institutions that you're working within. And so it's a critical lens on how are we shifting when there's conflict so that we're creating a more just society.
Thanks, Amy. Danny, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, I definitely agree. For me, it was like a restorative process for me, because from as early as I can remember, from the time I was born to I was 7 years old, like I grew up in a household, it was full of love. I had both parents, a grandmother, an older brother. I felt safe and protected and loved and cared for. Even though there wasn't a lot of verbal communication, just the presence of my family being there, I felt safe and secure. But when my parents separated, like that took a turn for the worse. And I became detached from that sense of security, that sense of love. So yeah, for me, it was restoring. I had to get back to that love that was already instilled within me. Like in order for me to feel whole, I had to love myself, because I was looking for it outside of myself. That's why I had turned to the streets. But you know, in prison, I was able to reconnect to that. As ironic as that may sound, like while I was in prison, I was able to connect with that love that I already had inside of me. And that's what began to make me whole. But I knew a lot of people who grew up and their households were not stable. It was not love present. It was very chaotic, very traumatic. So yeah, for those people in those situations, it definitely needs to be transformative. They need something entirely different. They need to be introduced to something new, and they need to be made whole in that sense. So that's definitely the difference. Some people you don't want to take back to where it started. They need something new. Some people want to take them back to how it started, and they will still transform. They will still evolve. Yeah, that's what I wanted to say about that. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Danny. And I'll just add to that, it was the men at Macomb who really introduced me many, many years ago to maybe questioning the term rehabilitation, because it presumes a prior state to be habilitated back towards. And they really said what we need is transformation, that so many of them said, there isn't something to be rehabilitated back to that was working. There is something to transform into. And so to think about that maybe on the individual level as we think about the language we use, but also from a restorative and transformative justice perspective, thinking about if we're restoring, maybe we're restoring back to something in relationship that was working, to something in a classroom that was working, but that so often the structures and the systems are violent and are harmful, and that we need to transform those structures and systems, not necessarily restore back to a state in which we continue to suffer the consequences of them. All right, we just have a minute left. Amy and Danny, do you have final words? No pressure.
Again, go ahead, Amy. Go ahead, Amy.
I would just encourage people that if you're inspired or curious, please reach out. I'm happy to talk with people. I also would say there's a lot to be read and reflected on individually, and you can start doing this work in your own life personally, whether that's in your own relationships, your own community, how you treat your neighbors. This work can start right now, and you can figure out ways to start having an RJ mindset in your own life.
And yeah, that's all I was going to say. I just encourage everybody to study more, read more about restorative justice, also transformative justice, and just try to identify ways and alternatives to the current criminal punishment system. And again, like, just be mindful of how we interact with one another and how we engage our communities, invest in social capital, take care of your community, take care of yourself. Yeah, peace and love.
Can't think of a better way to end than that. Thank you so much to Danny and Amy. Thank you to everyone who joined us today. Reminder that there'll be a short survey right when you close the webinar, and we'd really love to hear your feedback about what you learned, how we can improve events like this in the future. And you'll be receiving an email in the next week with the recording and a link to additional resources. So until our paths cross again, be well, take care. Bye.